just the regenerative agriculture practices we're studying. The Dices Foundation has done research from coast to coast in the US and in Canada. The project that I'm here to talk about specifically is the 1,000 Farms Initiative. We're in our first 2 years, regenerative practices. So Dices was started by this cool guy, Jonathan Lundgren. He was formerly a USDA entomologist, and he left that because he wanted to be engaged in research that was more directly reflective of and applicable to farmers. He was in the Common Ground documentary. I think we're going to have one of the people involved with that here as well. And I was actually also in the Common Ground documentary. There's the cut that I saw. I can be seen in the background yawning, the biggest yawn you've ever seen while he gives a talk. So to keep an eye out for both of us. The core premise of Dices is that farmers are already doing all the research. It's called doing something different with their farm or being a crazy farmer. And so the problem is that what so many of these innovative farmers lack is the independent scientific support to not only help them continue their research, but also to validate the transferability and scalability of the practices that they follow across different industries and regions. So Dices and its grad students, they've done lab research on bugs, and they've done farm test plots. But for the 1,000 Farms Initiative specifically, we let the farmers lead the way on research, since a lot of them have been doing it all along. And there are a lot of farmers doing crazy cool stuff, and we want to compare as many of them as we possibly can. Most of our research is focused on farmers who are currently transitioning, because as many of you know, I'm sure that's the sticky part. But we also get plenty of snapshots of growers who are already along in their regenerative journey. This is where we went 2022, the first year of the 1,000 Farms Initiative. I was not involved in this research, but this was something like 17 states and 389 farms in the first year. And then last year, going up to Manitoba and Saskatchewan as well, we visited like 18, 19, 20 states and 412 farms. So we visit orchards, and we visit vineyards, and we visit rangelands and croplands and market gardens, pretty much anything you can imagine, to see what folks are actually doing and to try to quantify all their practices and effects. So how we do our research is we pick a given industry in a given region. So the Texas Panhandle and grazers is the first trip that I went on. And we'll go for the first year, and that's year 1. And then we return year 2, 3, 5, and 10 to capture the whole transition process. And then we'll also go to farmers who are more established in their regenerative journey, kind of just visit them for 1 year and get snapshots of all those people. So we get as many different growers each year as we can. And these trips are like 7 to 9 of us going around the country in minivans. We'll hit 3 or 4 farms a day, every day in a given week. And then the next week do the same thing, 12-hour days, 14-hour days. So we get really good overtime going on these trips. We pull a ton of data from the field. We test soil and water and plant diversity and insects. I'll run through that. In 2022, in addition to the, 17 total states and provinces we went to, we did almost 20,000 soil cores. And we took 132,000 pictures of bugs. We identify every single bug we catch to the species level. And then we have our field days, and I'll talk about those as well. And then, last year, up to those numbers even more, almost 29,000 soil cores, 192,000 pictures of bugs. So there's a lot of research, and we dig a lot of soil cores. We spend so much time digging soil cores. So, and then I was considering whether or not to put this slide up, but I figured I might as well. We also spend a lot of time sleeping in the vans afterwards because it's so exhausting. So generally the data we collect, there's soil. So we do 0 to 60 centimeter cores. We do for nutrient analysis, that's the Haney test. We do 0 to 15 centimeter cores for biological analysis, PLFAs, phospholipid fatty acids. We take bulk density samples, and we also do take soil archives. And we probably at this point have one of the largest private soil archives in the country. Our lab is full of dried dirt. We do water sampling, so we do the standard USDA 6-inch infiltration conductivity of the soil, and it doesn't disturb the surface of the soil when you measure infiltration. For insect sweeps, for insect sampling, we do sweeps in the foliar layer, and then we put down this like foot-by-foot quad that we suck bugs out of to dig around to the detritus sphere to find insect populations there. For plants, We take biomass readings with a falling plate meter. So we have this like bar that has measurements on, and we drop a plate aligned with the bar, and then how far it falls tells us how much biomass is beneath it. And then we get a species count for every transect. We get a percentage of green cover and total ground cover. We have an ornithologist go out on all of our trips to get bird counts. We also put bird song monitors out. And then we do yield analysis. So we get any of the grains or produce, tomatoes and kale and dairy, forage, grass quality. We take all of the samples and send them off to labs to do nutrient analyses on them. And then we take general readings like temperature and moisture and compaction. And then we have our grower surveys as well, where we ask growers what their management is, what their financial situation is, how that might be affected in this regenerative process, their decision-making and their influences, so where they learn what they learn and how they decide to do what they do. We ask about their physical health, and then we ask about their social and mental well-being as well. That's kind of our data grab bag. So yeah, all this data. The main question we're asking is broadly, do regenerative practices have any positive benefit in any given region? And what kinds of practices have what kinds of benefit? And what have different farmers been able to do successfully? What practices are most effective? What practices are easiest, so that farmers might be able to do those first and then succeed or feel encouraged to try more things. Right now, since this is just year 2, primarily what we've been doing is processing and organizing all this data. So we take hundreds of thousands of pictures of bugs, and currently they're identified by an entomologist who has done more than 1 million bug IDs for Ichthyosis. And we're developing an AI platform that'll identify bugs to the species level. And then we're drying our soil samples. We're sending them to and from all the labs, just organizing all this data. And it'll take years and years to analyze all this stuff. But we're not really digging into specific trends right now. What we want to do broadly first is quantify and prove whether regenerative practices actually work. Do they work in Texas? Do they work in Indiana? Do they work with 10 inches of annual rainfall? Do they work with 40 inches of annual rainfall? Do they work in orchards and rangelands and market gardens? And we've been on 150,000 acre ranches. We've been on backyard garden plots. So we want to test all of it. We have our controls we take as well, of course. And this is a grazing conference, so I don't know how many of y'all have spent time in cornfields, conventional cornfields, or in conventional cornfields in Indiana, or in conventional cornfields in Indiana when it's 104 degrees in July. But these controls are the least fun to sample by far. I mean, the cornfields are very inhospitable. The only bugs we ever really see in there are little beetles, and otherwise that's pretty much it. They're basically sterile. The closest ecological equivalent to them is a parking lot, I think. So yeah, we have our conventional controls, but part of the logic of taking all this data, going to all these hundreds and hundreds of farms every year, is that we can control them against each other and kind of tease out these broader trends from all these different regions and all these different industries. I also personally think that we should be testing forests and front lawns and roadsides as our controls, but right now we're just focusing on land under ag management. So I think there are 4 important aspects of research. Primarily, for us, it's scientific validation. We really want to validate what growers are doing and help them use the language of research and independent data and an objective science to really help them legitimize what they're doing. And as with most researchers, yeah, we take what growers say and do, and we do our best to prove that's actually the case. And so these publications that we do in big research journals, of course, they affect academics and other researchers and policymakers and businessmen and business people and growers. And all these folks contribute to on-the-ground change. But I think another important part of our research is we want to encourage farmers to try to make changes. And so, and it's pretty obvious from YouTube videos of farmers and soil health schools that anecdotal evidence is a pretty compelling thing for a lot of people as well. So we also kind of engage in a more immediate data feedback sort of system where we just tell farmers, like on our field days, like, we've sampled your neighbor's fields. They really have cut their irrigation in half. They really have cut their insecticides, and they don't see any hit to yields or any pest damage. And that informal data feedback is also really important for growers. So there's a whole spectrum of evidence and proof that affects people differently. And as researchers, I don't think we should focus entirely on publishing, because there's so many other aspects to research. And another one of those aspects would be research as facilitating other farmers' research. And so we give our data all back to the farmers for free. I don't know if I said that the data we pull is worth about $7,000. We give that all to the growers for free. And then otherwise we anonymize it all when we process all of it, and no other private entity has any access to it. We want the farmers that we work with to feel empowered to continue doing their own research and messing around. We're kind of just the nerds with the numbers to help back them up a little bit. And then some of the tools we use, we also want to encourage farmers to use themselves to get more immediate data feedback. So we use a soil penetrometer, which is some little device you stab into the soil with a dial that'll spin and tell you compaction. And we teach them about the water infiltration tests and everything, and the soil tests they can do. And then also, in theory, in the future, they'll be able to take their own bug picks and upload them to bug box and track their own insect populations. So yeah, research as validation, research as facilitation, research as relationship is another important one, I think. So we do our field days, and we're trying to do more and more field days where we have hundreds of people come together in a given region to build a sense of community or solidarity amongst the growers, to share ideas, maybe get more farmers to know each other, maybe get some on the fence growers to start trying some things. Yeah, and in a lot of places, especially in the Midwest, it's what I'm familiar with is Midwest cropping systems. And I'm sure it's the case in New England too, that the regenerative growers are the ones that are really often ostracized. So it's also really important to use research as encouragement, I think, to just be out there to show growers that people are paying attention and that we care about what they're doing, and that what they're doing matters. So just being out there to share excitement with growers and passion, and just to listen to growers curiously, I think that's really important as well. More or less close to wrapping this up. I think I'm essentially on track. But I do want to say that I think it's really important that we question the premise of everything as much as possible. And researchers, we're supposed to be really good at doing that. We're supposed to be good at asking the questions. But I think oftentimes we're not that great at questioning the premise. One of the fundamental reasons that we're all at this conference, listening to this panel about how we can study growers and understand how agriculture can be less destructive, is that our dominant culture tends to value production over life. We all tend to value production over life. It's what got us into this ecological poly-crisis. It's why farming is destructive in the first place, because farmers are made to value the production of their farms over the life of their farms. So, and I think our dominant science also tends to take that for granted, that production matters more than life. I think we really need to question production as a solution to everything. One example is, I think it's really important to question whether we should commodify everything we possibly can and try to sell every new discovery or next whatever trendy thing. I think it's really important to question to what extent our really infinitely complex social and ecological ecosystems can be reduced down to a handful of variables that are often really easily manipulated into defending whatever the person researching them wants to defend, or into defending the status quo. I'm not really convinced that absorbing all of these problems we have into our dominant economy is the best way to get the thriving agricultural and human and ecological systems that we want. But there are people doing tons of great work under these systems of production, and they need us researchers to validate what they're doing, and that's super important. We need to put it in the language of institutions and businesses, which is often profit and efficiency and carbon, money. But there are things that we can't really ever fully measure with our instruments. And those are really valuable things too. Like, how much farmers are eager to welcome us or eager to talk about what they're doing. How much how grateful they are, excited they are to be producers. I mean, it's such a beautiful thing to be a steward of life. I would love to do that someday. I know how hard it is. I've worked farm jobs, but it's an incredibly powerful thing to get to be a farmer. And to experience the abundance around you when you're in a field, when you're in a really healthy pasture, to hear the mother cows and the insects clicking around you, to smell the soil breathing and digesting. I mean, it's so meaningful to be surrounded by these living ecosystems. It's a feeling that it's really hard to put into numbers. And we talk about it too. We talk about getting our spit samples, measure our cortisol levels every field we go to see what our stress response is. I mean, farmers will make us homemade meals. Farmers take their kids out to hang out with us all day. Farmers talk with us for the 2 to 3 hours. And so to get that appreciation for life and community and learning into numbers, to get that care and generosity into data, that's tough. And it's really easy to get lost in the data and all the measurables. And data is great. I mean, data is super important. I think it's crucial that we do validate this stuff for everyone. It's really helpful to study all of this as much as we can. But I think it's all too easy to think that numbers are reality or that they're all that matter. But the numbers are approximations of reality, and they're only approximations of reality so far as we let them be. And when we only focus on a few things or a few variables or a few commodities or a few dominant narratives, we ignore so many other things, so many really important things. And as many indigenous folk and radical farmers have told me, to be alive is to be a member of a community of intimately interconnected kin. To be so intimately connected to a place that the distinctions between individual self and surroundings become increasingly meaningless. I mean, you eat the bodies of an ecosystem, they become your body. You exhale your microbes into the atmosphere. You get soil and manure on you. You have to go pee behind that tree over there. I mean, we're constantly cycling our ecosystems through us, and our ecosystems cycle us through them. And that's just, I think, the most meaningful thing you can do is to be a part of that ecosystem of life, to help farmers be a part of that ecosystem of life, to support it in your research and how you live your life in general. Yeah, to belong to the community of life is a really important thing. And I really hope that our science can help with that. So yeah, that's more or less my talk. I will, I guess, take a question or whatever the plan is with that. And then there's two other cool folks who have a lot of awesome things to say. And also, if any of you are farmers, I know that's kind of the next few days in the talk, but you can scan that and sign up for the 1,000 Farms Initiative and get $7,000 worth of free data and have a bunch of crazy kids coming out of a van sampling on your farm. So
thanks, Eric. Thank you so much. And I was actually one of the farms that they visited, and it was a crazy group that got out of the back of a van. And one old guy who just listened to birds. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we switch over, do we have a question from the audience? Anyone?
Thanks for that talk. That was your passion bleeds through loud and clear.
Thanks.
I have I'm wondering whether there's any data that you've collected that connects farm viability, as in their ability to actually function in our current system with the other research that you're doing. And has there been any identification of supporting the kind of regenerative work that we're talking about that is not commoditized in a way that supports that viability?
So, okay. Yeah. We talk a lot with our field days and with growers about the other aspects of farming and different things that people can do. But currently the research that the trends we're analyzing, it's just big picture stuff that will broadly say whether or not regenerative practices can be applied to different contexts. And we're kind of just leaving it at that. So we're not really diving deeper yet into ways that regenerative practices can be adopted under or outside of dominant economic paradigms. And it's definitely, I mean, it's something we all talk about with a lot of the farmers. But in terms of publishing that research and releasing it, yeah, the goal right now is just just to be able to say definitively whether or not these practices actually work. And then the next step would be having conversations like that. Yeah, does that address what you wanted? Cool. Would you like me to stay up here, or what's the plan for the panel afterwards?
Yeah, come on down, and we'll have time for more questions at the end. We want to have a good discussion with all three of our presenters, but thank you so much, Eric, and I'll take that. And next up, Mario Machado.
All right.
Tell us about CIG.
Yeah. Well, very excited to be here. So I'll be presenting about an NRCS conservation innovation grant that I'm working on through my role with Biological Capital and a bunch of other partners. But this project is called Managing Pastures for Healthy Farms and Soils Across Vermont. So to start, just shout out to our project partners. We work with the Vermont Land Trust, the University of Vermont Extension, and the University of Vermont, as well as a bunch of farms across the state. This is a $2 million grant. It was awarded back in 2021, I believe. Yeah, but it's a 5-year project that's going to be looking at the transition to managed intensive rotational grazing and implementation of other soil health practices on farms over the course of 5 years. This is a huge project. There are many moving pieces. I'm just one of like many project personnel that are currently working with us and past alum of the project as well. So just a shout out to them and our wonderful farmers as well. But yeah, so the basic premise of this project sounds very nice, right? So when managed well, grass-based beef and other livestock farms have been shown to increase soil fertility, improve water quality, sequester carbon, encourage biodiversity and wildlife, encourage farm profitability and producer quality of life, produce high quality meat and increase beneficial nutrients, and preserve a working landscape that enhances Vermont's visual attraction to visitors and residents. That is a huge premise, right? And part of this project is really teasing out the details of this, trying to provide data that can sort of substantiate some of this premise, but also sort of figure out how do you go about providing not just data, but also a narrative that sort of shows that this is actually the case. I mean, this is a very complicated, complex system that we're trying to sort of tease apart. So the project overall, there are two big pieces of it. The first is a research component. So as farmers implement these practices, we're looking at ecological, social, and economic outcomes and collecting data and doing research on all three of these things to sort of see whether incorporating pasture-based soil health practices on farms actually works for different geographic locations across Vermont. The other component of this is a practice-based component. So we're providing payments to farmers to implement these practices. So there's both a implementation component that provides funding that allows farmers to overcome some barriers to adoption, to either begin practicing these things on their farm or to expand the practice of these different techniques on their farm at the same time as we're doing research. So I'll say at the outset, I'm a social scientist. So I am more on the social economic side of this research, but we have a bunch of different expertise across the project. But just as a way to highlight the fact that like these are very complex and very different expertise that are required to be able to speak to all these different components. And I think like to get a holistic sense of how these practices impact farms, you really need to have all of these different components that speak to each other, not just the economic and the ecological, but also sort of the social components as well. But that just means that the complexity of this project increases tenfold. So I think part of what I'll be talking through today is, I don't have any results to show. We're still in the process of collecting data, analysis, and sort of figuring out, what are the dominant trends that we see in this process. But I'll be sort of talking more about just like, what are the challenges with trying to do a project like this that is so integrated and so holistic? There's many of them, and I'll sort of be getting into a little bit of that today. So the practices that we support, there are 5 that were initially in the grant. Only 3 of these we're really working with currently for several different reasons. But the 3 main practices that we're working with farms and paying farms to implement are managed intensive rotational grazing. 72 hours is the sort of definition around which we define managed intensive rotational grazing. Usually this is more like a day or 2. We try to encourage farms to make these rotations as short as possible. There are a lot of constraints there in terms of the on-farm labor and how that works, but this is sort of the working definition that we are using. The other is supplemental seeding, and this can include a bunch of different methods of seeding. Also nutrient amendments such as wood ash compost, biochar. The other 2 practices that were part of the original grant but are not being paid currently through the project are annual to perennial conversion. Almost all the farms we worked with already had all perennial crops, so there was no annuals to be converted. And subsoiling and keyline plowing, which is a really interesting topic. I'd be happy to talk about more later. I'm doing some other research on this sort of as a part of another project I'm working on. But this is not being paid for in the project, but it's certainly something that farmers in Vermont and around New England are really interested in. So yeah, these are the 3 main practices that we are paying farmers to implement. We have 15 enrolled farms across the state. 65 different fields. That's sort of an important distinction we'll talk about later. Over 1,000 acres and all different production types. We have dairy producers, beef producers, sheep producers, and a number of intrepid farmers that are doing mixed species grazing, which are just fascinating systems in and of themselves. And like I said, these are farms from all across Vermont. We tried to get as good of a geographic distribution as we could. So there are, these are farms that vary in experience from 0 to 20 years who have already implemented managed intensive rotational grazing, different soil textures. Of the biophysical regions in Vermont, 5 of them are represented. And yeah, these operations vary in size. We have smaller farms around 30 acres to 50 acres, and we have much larger farms upwards of 400 to 500 acres. So the experimental design is, I think, fairly straightforward at least as it's conceptualized. So this is a before and after comparison. So year one, we go in, we take all these baseline measurements, do a bunch of soil testing, farm surveys, practice tracking, and there's also a technical service component to this as well, where we provide we have technical service providers that provide technical service to farms. And then at the end of this project, we'll be doing measurements as well to sort of see how this transition has impacted not just the ecological, but also the economic and social dimensions of these farms. In between that, every year we have sampling that we do as well. But the basic sort of like structure of the program is sort of before and after comparison. What this means in terms of experimental design is that we have just a boatload of methods, ecological methods, financial data collection, social data collection as well, and trying to sort of distill some pretty basic or sort of pretty top line narratives out of these different and disparate data sets is sort of one of the big challenges here. So in the ecological data, we have a variety of soil tests. We're looking at bulk density, soil biology, species diversity, forage production, penetration, infiltration, and management practice and history. In the financial side of things, we're looking at monthly expense tracking, also labor tracking, and just practice tracking, how farmers are implementing these practices. And on the social side of things, we have an annual survey, we have some interviews we do, we also have a variety of in-person events, focus groups, and increasingly what I've been realizing through this work on the social science side of things, and something that Eric mentioned as well, is this anecdotal piece. Anecdotal data, the academic world doesn't really know what to do with this all the time. I once had a professor tell me that the plural of data is not, or the plural of anecdote is not data, which stuck with me for a long time. But I think like from a practical perspective, this anecdotal piece is really important in terms of what farmers are really looking for. And the stories that farmers tell other farmers are a huge component of whether people are incentivized to actually implement these practices or not. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we go on. But so for the ecological research, there are a number of driving questions. So on the most basic level, do soil management practices positively impact soil health, soil water dynamics, and pasture productivity? What management practices and practice combinations are the most supportive for healthy soils and pastures? And what other environmental variables alter the impact of these practices on soil health outcomes? So the metrics for answering this question, again, a variety. This ecological component here has definitely the most methodologies, the most methods that we're using. So from the soil perspective, we're looking at physical soil structure, soil chemistry, and soil biology. From the water, in terms of water, we're looking at infiltration and using a penetrometer to understand soil compaction. And from the pasture and forage side of things, we're looking at forage quality, species diversity, and productivity. For people who do this work, you can realize that there is like a ton of methods that underlie all of this. And these methods are both like very timely and like very labor intensive in order to get all this data. So this is a bunch of data. Underlying all this, of course, is like past management history, and something that sort of has come across in a number of both the ecological and the economic and the social, is that so much of what a farmer is able to do is based on where they're coming from, not just sort of like the decisions that they've made, but the decisions of landowners before them. And so understanding this management history is really important for kind of contextualizing all of this different data. So this is just some pictures from the field, infiltration tests for those that have done it. They're very relaxing because you just sit in one spot and just watch water slowly seep into the ground. But these infield moments in the field to collect data is also a moment for, like, as Eric was mentioning with their work, like really being able to like experience the farm and sort of understand these things from a more detailed perspective. And the anecdotal data is not just from what farmers are talking about and what conversations with farmers are being had, but what are we seeing while we're out there, when we're spending time in the fields? And this is the stuff that farmers are doing, all the time anyways. So yeah, very interesting just methodologies in terms of getting all this data. So this is our basic schedule of methods and data collection. This gives me so much stress just looking at this, because this is tons of hours and tons of time and driving around. We're not going across the country. We're going to all over Vermont. But I think, in terms of labor requirements, it just takes a long time. So this is just sort of the basic schedule. And this is again a before and after. We'll have these in between years, 2023 and 2024, what we'll be doing, what we have done in 2023 and we'll be doing in 2024, these like seasonal measurements as well. Another component of this, which is something I had proposed in the proposal, but had kind of tried to figure out how we could do this in a reasonable way is measuring forage production. So one of the ways we're trying to do this is through a partnership with Organic Valley and Planet Labs. So they do remote sensing based estimates of forage biomass, and they produce these maps, as you can see on the left here, that basically show where the highest quality forage is. And these maps go out to farmers. So the farmers can make decisions based on where they're putting their animals. So what we're doing is sort of a data for data exchange with Planet Labs. We're providing ground truth data using something called the rising plate meter, which is a really fun, interesting, and sometimes infuriating tool. But we're basically providing ground truth data on forage production that we can then provide to Planet Labs in exchange for their data. So this is how we're estimating forage. Financial research. So the financial component here, I think, is really important. This farm viability question is do these practices work? Yes or no? That's an important question to answer, but that's not the whole question of whether or not a farm is going to actually be able to adopt this in the end. So some of the driving questions here are, what are the costs per acre for implementing these soil health management practices in Vermont? What are the labor requirements? Another really important component here, if a practice works and it saves money, but it takes 10 times as much time, I think that's a big motivation for a farmer not to do a thing. So understanding the labor requirements of these practices and understanding how these costs compare with these other benefits that come from implementing the practices. So what are your trade-offs there? What are your co-benefits that come through implementing these practices? Again, a bunch of different metrics here. We're looking specifically at labor hours, and expenses. So expenses vary depending on the practices, but this includes infrastructure, tools, inputs, and fuel. But yeah, these are sort of our metrics for really getting in here and seeing whether or not these practices make sense from a financial or an economic perspective. For the farmers, and there are some farmers in the project that are in this group. I apologize, this might be stress inducing. These are the big giant spreadsheets that we had them fill out to track their expenses and their practices. But this is sort of how we go about gathering the data from farms based on their own records or their own, just after the fact, after the month of January is done or month of July is done or whatever, going back and sort of filling in what hours it took you, how much these practices cost. And these are just our basic methodology for collecting this kind of data. And at the end, what we'd like to say is whether or not we can tell farmers what are the benefits that they can expect and what are the costs that they will incur by implementing these practices. And I think this seems like a pretty basic premise. What did it cost? What am I going to get out of it? But really being able to tease that apart is really challenging for a number of reasons. Farms are very, very different. Even similar farms, similar operations, similar size can have very, very different contexts. So costs for one farm might be very, very different for another farm for the same practice. And benefits can also vary tremendously. So we are developing these sort of based on some work that the American Farmland Trust is doing, sort of cost and benefit analysis using the data. But this is something we're sort of in the process of developing as we analyze the data and finalize some of the project. But it's it's just to be able to say something this definitive is both really important, I think, for farmers, but also very challenging from a research perspective. On the social research side of things, a number of driving questions here. So what are the motivations for farmers to participate in this project? What factors drive the adoption of these new practices? What barriers inhibit the adoption of these new practices? What are the perceived benefits and concerns regarding them? And what are the perceived versus actual costs? I mean, this last component is important as well, because a lot of farms might be really reticent to adopt a new practice because they think it's really expensive. But if they can see maybe through this process that it's not as expensive or vice versa. So understanding what are the relationships between actual costs and perceived costs is really important. So the premise here, and this is more of sort of my wheelhouse in terms of the work that I'm really focused on. So for practices to become sustainable, which to me means lasting beyond the grant and funding cycle, which I think is a really important part of a lot of these projects, farmers need to maintain these practices. To maintain them, farmers need to see the value that these practices provide. And that value is financial, but it's not only financial, and that's an important thing. It has to do with farmer values, the impacts of labor on labor and quality of life, impacts on soil health, animal health, and the and the overall farm system. So from my perspective as a social scientist, I'm really concerned with this question of how can we gather data and create metrics to show farmer values and perspectives, how they shift or not throughout the duration of this project. And going to Eric's point as well, I think like, you know, this data does two things. One, it provides information that shows these practices work, do they not work? What are the costs? What are the trade-offs? And the other thing is validating, I think, a lot of the ideas and the work that farmers are doing. So there's kind of this, dual purpose to a lot of this research as well. So for this social science, there are a number of focus areas. So specifically in terms of ecological concerns, trying to understand how the farmers in our project understand biodiversity, productivity, resilience, and invasive species and concerns around these different things. What are their perceptions, barriers, prior experiences, and what are the benefits and concerns around practice adoption? And then this other component of cost perception. So startup costs, what are the maintenance costs? This is also very important. You can get something started, but like, what does it cost to maintain that practice? And then what are the sort of the minimum incentive payments needed to get a farm to adopt a practice? Oftentimes these payments are not exorbitant. It's like, basically, if you can help me implement this practice, you know, I'm happy to maintain it for the years to come. But understanding these dynamics as they relate to payments, I think is really important as we think about other projects moving forward, other sort of payment projects to try to get farmers to adopt sustainable practices. And the methods we use for this: annual surveys, interviews, focus groups, in-person events, and anecdotal data collection. This is, again, this sort of spread throughout the year. We do this sort of in conjunction with some of our ecological data collection and also sort of aside from that as well. And I think maybe just to finish out here, I think I'm good on time, but just some basic takeaways about, like, you know, I don't have any results to show, as I said, but like just thinking through some of the challenges of doing this kind of work. What are the challenges of doing sort of whole system impacts? Like, how do you understand all these different components of a farm as it shifts through time? So one of the big things here is this question about aggregation and disaggregation. So in this context, what are our units of analysis? 15 farms is not really like a huge sample, right? In terms of what data you're able to talk about. You can't say much with 15 farms, I think, from maybe an ecological perspective. One of the ways we've worked around this is by treating each field as a unit. So each field then becomes our unit of analysis. That gives us a sample size of 65. So from a social science perspective, we're dealing with a sample size of 15. From an ecological perspective, we're dealing with a sample size of 65. So this is a way we sort of balance this. But, you know, farms don't operate field by field. They operate as a whole system. And so this question of aggregation, disaggregation can get very complicated very quickly. And if we're trying to attribute the results we're getting per acre, this question of like balancing between the farm and the field becomes a real balancing act as well. Also, comparing across different farms. All farms are unique, even within the same farm type. So you could compare the same size beef farm in one place to the same size beef farm in another place. And in some ways, that's like comparing apples and apples. And in some ways, it's like comparing apples and oranges. This is a real big challenge. So like the scale of the farms, their history, whether this is a newer beginning farmer or a seasoned farmer, what their land tenure situation is, all of these things really significantly impact, you know, especially costs, and a lot of the dynamics around some of the social questions that we're asking are really impacted by this. So, you know, understanding these differences across farms, sometimes I look at our sample of 15 farms and I'm like, how do we say anything about these 15 farms definitively across the board? It's a real big challenge. But, you know, it's something that I think looking at such a big change for these farms from different perspectives actually allows us to kind of triangulate some of those differences, as much as it is also challenging in its own way. So then there's this question of planned versus actual practice implementation. When you write the grant, it sounds awesome and everything works perfectly when you talk to your funders and whatever. But the reality of doing on-farm trials is that like things never go smoothly ever. So this past year, we had, obviously in Vermont, July 2023, we had these crazy flooding events that created a huge number of challenges for our farmers in terms of managing their herd and trying to implement these practices, you know, and stick to these, you know, definitions that we have of these practices as we're paying them. It's a challenge. So we try on the project side, we try to have a lot of, you know, flexibility and trying to work, you know, with farmers where they're at, because these things are very real. These are very real challenges. But, you know, as much as this happens, like all of this introduces noise into the data. So the challenge of trying to say something definitively only becomes more challenging as this, you know, rubber meets the road here. So this is something that we're, again, working through in a bunch of different ways, but it's certainly a crux of trying to do a big whole system sort of analysis like this. And then combining different types of data. This is something that like, I think as a social scientist, I'm more comfortable with, but maybe like, I think it's a challenge for some people depending on where you're sitting. And especially if you're trying to take these results and publish them, it is a challenge to make these different types of data speak to each other. So, ecological data, we have the most well-defined metrics here, but this is super labor intensive to collect. And we're left with this threshold of statistical significance to be able to say definitively one way or another whether something worked or not. Sometimes that statistical significance belies some of the underlying dynamics. And there are like these anecdotal things that come through that maybe don't pop out when we are looking at the data statistically, or when we're looking at these very well-defined metrics. So the ecological data is both like, in some ways, like probably our best way to be able to say something definitively about how these projects work. And it's also, I think, a challenge to make this data speak to the other types of data we're looking at. Financial data, we have implementation versus maintenance costs and how to compare these across different types of farm. And from the social science side of things, again, we have the least well-defined metrics, but the social science stuff really becomes important to contextualize what we're seeing in the ecological data and the financial data. And there, again, like the role of anecdotal data is super important and something that I'm personally working with a lot lately. So the idea here, just in terms of what we want to do with this project, is thinking about how we can produce high quality research along with clear, relevant recommendations and guidance to farmers while taking a holistic, whole system approach. It's a big challenge, but it's something that I think we are in a unique position to sort of like, work through, and I think provide a model for other projects going forward and how to do this. For those that are interested, this is a recent publication with Jen Cole, yours truly. We just wrote this up in Barn Raiser. This is just sort of, explores a bit of the project and gives some background on it. So thank you.
As you may have been able to guess, we had a few conversations with people sampling on my farm this summer that prompted this entire session. So while we invite Dr. Goslee up to switch over to her presentation, is there a burning question from the audience?
I'm just curious, you're talking about management intensive grazing, which to me is about a 6-month period. I'm wondering if you'd look at practices in the winter at all, or
We do. So we monitor, we collect data.
Wait.
So we're collecting financial data all year round in terms of what are the labor requirements and expenses over the winter time. Ecological data, we sort of capture those as a snapshot every summer. But yeah, I think it's something that, and it depends. I know some people are grazing all year round, even in Vermont and some places up here in the north. But generally our data snapshots are like in terms of ecological data is like in the summertime in that window. We have, so there's like 3 sampling windows throughout the summer. So we do like a early season, cool season sampling in May. We do a hot season in July and one in September. So there is some temporal distribution there, but in terms of winter sampling, and I think there's probably value in that. I don't want to be sampling in the winter time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goslee.
Great. I am really excited to have the opportunity to wrap this session up after those 2 really good introductions to what I want to talk about, which Eric and Mario both laid out really nicely, the amount of work that goes into collecting data and the complexity of trying to make decisions based on that data. And so I'm going to think a little more broadly about, well, okay, are there things we can do to help farmers make better decisions? What is the role of science? What can science do? What can't science do in making agricultural decisions? And I'm going to jump to the punchline first. There is no right answer. We can't say this is going to be the best thing for you. What science is good for is helping with the options and the trade-offs. So the overall goal, I think we can all agree on, which is going to be feed more people on the same or less land area without making other things worse. This sometimes is called sustainable intensification or agricultural intensification or ecological intensification. But that's our basic goal. And we're here at this particular conference because we all know and agree that grazing is part of the way we want to do that. Unlike, say, this agribusiness company in this 1930 ad from Fortune magazine predicting what the beef industry was going to look like in 1975. That's not where we want to go. But this is hard. How do we do this? How do we make sure that grazing agriculture and agriculture in general is sustainable and environmentally friendly and economically feasible in all of those competing goals that we're after. Especially in the Northeast, where we're working in complex landscapes with a lot of competing uses, where you can always sell your land to be developed for a whole bunch of money. And there are all sorts of environmental and regulatory and social and ecological pressures. We have huge mixed landscapes with lots of forest, lots of development, some cropland, some pasture. But even with the complex landscapes, agriculture and grazing related agriculture is a huge part of the economy of our region. So how do we make decisions? How can we look at all of the possible ways we could go and figure out which ones are going to be best for us and which ones are going to ensure that grazing livestock is an economically and ecologically viable option in our region, both now and in the future? I'm interested in questions of scale, both in space and in time, not just what's the right decision now, but how do we make sure that our decisions don't make things worse down the road? So I'm specifically interested in thinking about the intersection between science and practice and how we can use both of those to make better decisions, and how I, as a scientist, can ensure that the research I do is both relevant and shared in useful ways. I can write all of the peer-reviewed research papers in the world, but that's probably not going to make any difference to farmer decision-making. How do we make sure that what we do as scientists is both useful and usable? So thinking about what science is good for, I already said that science can't tell you the right answer. There's nothing I can do for research that's going to say that farm should do that thing and there are no possible other alternatives, except in maybe really rare cases. But what we can do is look at system complexity, and both Eric and Mario laid that out really well, the complexity of the systems they're working with, at all of the different options, at all of the different things they're studying. We can look at risk, and I would argue that a lot of scientists are really bad at comparing risk and articulating that in useful ways. Those error bars on all of our figures can be treated as a measure of risk, but that's not really good for making a decision off of. Same for uncertainty. We can look at what our research results are and come up with something like, perhaps, if you implement a certain practice, it'll work 90% of the time, fail dramatically 3% of the time, and 2% of the time, it will be the best thing that ever happened. So that farmers can make their own decisions based on that risk and uncertainty. The other thing science is really good at is laying out competing options and trade-offs. Now, here are all of the things that might work in your situation. And here is the risk associated with each, and here's the potential outcomes associated with each. So the person making the decision has all of that information. And that's really where I'd like to see us go, with a way to synthesize and share our research that emphasizes all four of those aspects. Because science can't do other parts. We can't determine the farm objectives. Everybody who manages a farm or owns a farm has plans for their farms and things they want to achieve, and that's important. People managing farms have local knowledge of what they've tried under their particular conditions and what works and doesn't. Personal preferences for the kinds of things they want to do and the way they want to manage, and their values, what their overall needs and wants are for their land that they manage. And that's part of the decision-making process too. And that's one it's much harder for science to work with. Some of the social sciences studies do look at those things, but also the person making the decision makes the decision based on where they're coming from. So I spend a lot of time thinking about scale and hierarchy and how situations or actions at some level affect and are affected by other levels. And this includes both time, from field, farm, landscape, all the way up to planet or space, and time from right now to long-term consequences at a century or more out. Now, most decisions don't really need much planning or decision support. or have much in the way of consequences, what to eat for breakfast, when to feed the chickens, whatever. And many other decisions are reactive rather than proactive. It's going to rain today, so I'll go put over a tarp over some equipment. That's also not something that needs much decision support other than maybe looking out the window at the clouds. I'm most interested in decisions made at moderate spatial and temporal scales. So field to farm and into landscape, and season, year, and decade. So what we're doing now that has implications into the future and within farm and beyond farm boundaries. So what do we need to know to make good decisions? What's the context of the decision? And I'm using that as a shorthand for things you can't change. For agriculture, that might include soil properties that aren't easily changed, like texture, the topography of your farm, the weather conditions, the site history, and thank you, Mario, for bringing that up already. Your neighbors, the regulations you have to operate under. But there are always options for things you can change, like what you plant in your pasture, your grazing management strategies, what kinds of inputs you use, and how much. And so where the science can come in is with the outcomes. If you change any of those things that you have options for, what are the possible results? What are the possible changes to production and to farm economics? But also, what are the possible non-monetary consequences? Changes in soil erosion, changes in nutrient cycling, changes in pollinator habitat and pollinator populations, which is something I've been sucked into a little bit from a research perspective over the last few years. So how do we effectively combine research findings and management practice to make the best possible decisions? And I'm a plant person. I'm a botanist and plant ecologist. So I'm going to talk mostly about within field plant diversity and then within farm land use. But then think about that not just for field and farm consequences, but also the landscape consequences beyond the farm boundaries, as well as the landscape context, all of those things that you can't change, that you have to make your management activities within. So for instance, plant species diversity mixtures. What happens if you plant this set of species or that set of species? Can we give guidelines about risk and opportunity related to those? Are there some plant mixtures that can better support farm objectives? But thinking beyond that, is a grazing pasture the best use for this field? Is there something that might be better there? And maybe grazing would be better in a different part of that farm. We have the option to not only have options within the field, but also between fields within a farm. And how do all of those possible choices affect outcomes on and off farm? A related question to that I don't have time to get into this morning is placing conservation practices as well as different field types, so you can get the biggest bang for the buck. So I'm interested in those questions and how we can quantify those possible outcomes and provide that information. So it's focused on plants. So I think about all of the context factors that affect plants, mainly climate, topography, and soils, as the thing that affect light, water, and temperature, which then the plants experience. And then with management layered on top of that. And we have pretty good data available in the Northeastern US for sure on topography and soils and climate. So one of the things I'm interested in is how do we make sure that people making decisions have access to those context information in useful ways to support those decisions? Is web soil survey good? Is going to the weather forecast good? What do you need to do that? One of the things I know there is a lot of interest in is better short-term seasonal and annual predictions. That would be super useful for farmers to be able to say, well, it looks like this is going to be a dry summer. And some of that information exists, but it's not all readily accessible or understandable or useful for agriculture. So I'm working with a group of scientists to improve that. So we've got better context information. One of the really huge things for planning is thinking about climate change. and what's going to happen in the future over the next few years, in the next few decades, and the rest of the century, and how that's already affecting grazing agriculture, and how it may constrain our future possibilities or expand on our future possibilities. And here, I think, is a really fruitful ground to be thinking about proactive rather than reactive decision-making. If we can think now about how the research we've already done can help us make better decisions in the face of climate change, that'll let us get ahead rather than going, oh, it's bad now. I should have changed 10 years ago. How can we get ahead of that? And a couple slides from the recently released National Climate Assessment, just point out things that you probably already know. In the Northeast, hot days haven't changed a lot yet, but nights have gotten hotter and there are fewer cold days. Heavy precipitation events have been the big one in the Northeast. We're getting more really heavy precipitation events. And even compared to the rest of the country, the Northeast is being the hardest hit by that right now. And the number of days with more than 2 inches of precipitation, more than 3 inches of precipitation, or even more than 5 inches of precipitation have gone way up. And this doesn't include 2023. This would be much more striking if we had that 2023 spike on there. It was a horrible, horrible event. So skipping to pastures, which is an area that I've done a lot of research. So pasture diversity has been of interest for a really long time. I'm a fan of this quote from 1888. I hold this proposition to be indisputable. And why can't we write scientific articles like that anymore? That any soil will yield a larger and more nutritious crop if sown with several kinds of nutritious grasses than when sown with only 1 or 2 species. But when I started doing this, we didn't even have a good handle on what was in Northeastern pastures. So I know some of you remember Matt Sanderson. He and Ben Tracy started this project to go out and look at what's in pastures. And over the many years of this study, which I joined a couple years into it, we sampled 44 farms with 2 to 8 pastures on each farm. All of these were actively grazed, mostly dairy and beef, a few sheep. Did soil sampling, interviewed the producers about management, looked at the topography and the climate and all of that. So we could start to understand both what's in pastures and how that relates to some of those basic context parameters. And we found 310 plant species, which was a lot more than most people expected. 58 species of grasses, 16 legumes, almost 200 species of forbs, and 38 woody plants. And incidentally, this work turned into an identification guide for Northeastern pasture plants, which is available on the Grazing Guide website and contains results on all of these, well, many of these species and where we found them. Just to give you an idea of what's out there, some species like bluegrass and white clover and tall fescue and orchard grass were found on nearly all pastures and were fairly abundant. Other species like dandelion, plantain, and red clover were found in a lot of pastures and were less abundant. But most of the species we found were both rare and uncommon, so not big components of pastures. This was really interesting. This is probably my favorite finding out of this project. So if you draw a vertical line down through this, the first thing you hit coming down, the higher number, is the number of species we found in that pasture. And if you keep going down, the green dot below that is the number of what you would think of as forage species, things you might plant or things you might encourage in your pasture, the forage grasses and legumes. And pretty much regardless of how many species you had in your pasture total, you had about the same number of species. Whether you had 15 plant species in your pasture or 73, you usually had about 8 forage species, somewhere between 3 to 12. And I think that's really interesting because that gives us some guidance on designing pasture plant mixtures. Probably putting in much more species than that isn't going to do you any good. This is what, in some of these, we had the whole range of kinds of pasture sampled, things that were seeded a few years ago, things that had never been seeded in the 50 years that anybody knew about it. So across the whole range of northeastern pastures, you get about 8 forage species in a pasture. But just knowing what's there doesn't really help. You need to know what it's doing. So each of those species has different traits and different responses to the environment and different production amounts and different seasonality. And so that mix of species altogether is what determines the production and the timing and the nutrient needs and so on, the drought resistance of that pasture. And we wanted to know if we could then take this knowledge about what's in pastures and get a better handle on what it's doing in pastures. So this led to a big research project. That's Louise Comas, who was an ARS postdoc at the time of this study, working for Howard Skinner. And she did a great deal of work growing forage species in the greenhouse and measuring plant traits, and then growing those in grazed plots at one of our field sites to try to get a handle on whether we could understand what's going on in these pastures well enough to be able to predict what's going to happen for species mixtures. And the usual way to do this is to look at grass, legume, and forb. But in fact, that doesn't work. That didn't give us any predictive capability whatsoever for looking at total production or timing of production, resistance to weed invasion, or so on. You have to include species identity. Presence of alfalfa was the strongest single variable in predicting any of those factors about production and timing of production, which makes it really hard to generalize. You can't say everybody should plant 5 species of grass and 2 species of legume and a forb or something like that. It has to be more nuanced than that. It has to go back to site context and actual species composition, which was really disappointing because that makes it harder to make recommendations and harder to do decision support because the decisions are much more complicated. We've also done a little bit of work looking at cultivars within species. Here's an example looking at winter mortality in ryegrass and how cold you have to freeze a ryegrass plant from different varieties before it dies. So we're trying to get a better handle on what's going on in pastures and what we might be able to recommend in this case for climate change and how well varieties are going to be adapted to future climates. But here too, it's complicated and there's a lot of variability across varieties. And it turns out when you do these in the field, I didn't include this slide, they don't necessarily respond according to the variety freeze tolerance because other things like snow cover make even more difference than variety selection. And that's a huge problem because, as you know, we've probably all observed, snow cover is becoming more erratic in the winter, which means our perennials may be more liable to freeze damage in the winter, even though winters are getting warmer, because winters are getting warmer, so there's less snow protecting them. But anyway, so we have lots of field data on lots of different things and plants and environmental consequences and soils and people collecting lots more to fill in gaps because there's plenty of things we don't know even after decades and decades of collecting these kinds of data. But there's definitely a role here for modeling in decision-making as well as field data, because we can't do everything. Even if you go to 1,000 farms, that's not all the kinds of farms. Even if you sample 15 fields and 15 farms and 68 fields in Vermont, that's nowhere near all the possibilities just in Vermont. So the people working in the field have to work with the people doing simulation modeling to address a couple of things. One is, what are all the possible what ifs? The simulation modeling is great for doing scenarios. Well, what if the nighttime temperatures increase another degree? What consequences is that going to have for growing plants and raising cattle and dairy production? What if we threw out all of our current plans and planted everything to a pasture mix? What's the consequences for the farm? You know, those are the kinds of things that the models are great for, things that you can't efficiently try or things that might be really risky and you'd like some more information. before you make the decision to actually do it. We can only go out and measure for one farm at one time with one set of practices, but we can model all of the different possibilities for that farm. And as long as the modelers are working with the people in the field to make sure that the models give reasonable results, or at least reasonable relative results, then that's great. The other place that we need models is often to try to understand the broader spatial effects of our on-farm management decisions, because things like water quality and soil erosion don't stay at the farm boundaries. Things move. A farm isn't a self-contained little unit. So here's one of the things we're thinking about, and all of the figures that went on that have disappeared. So I've got a postdoc right now, Kevin Lee, who is looking at this kind of landscape management from an ecosystem services perspective. And he's doing some really neat modeling work. He is focused right now on pollinators, on nutrient cycling, on water cycling, and is going to be adding in carbon sequestration and other aspects of biodiversity. One of the problems with this is that the major ecosystem services model, INVEST, was developed for conservation planning, and its agricultural components are awful. It's got a crop model that is pretty much unusable. It doesn't have anything that covers perennial crops or grazing. So we're working on ways to make this better, because it has really good modules for things like carbon sequestration and biodiversity and pollinators and water cycling and nutrient cycling, so that we can understand and put together those consequences. But it isn't good for agriculture yet. And so he's thinking about the questions of not just what would you put in a field, but what are the different options for fields and for parts of the farm. And we tend to think about that most from a grazing perspective. This field could be a cool season grassland or a warm season grassland or an annual crop, but there's always other options. We could develop it, and that's pretty permanent, and we can't come back from that. We could abandon it, in which case in the Northeast, it'll probably end up as an old field, then a shrubland, then a woodland. And you can come back from that, but it's challenging and expensive. So what he's looking at right now is crops and pollinator strips, and thinking about the trade-offs between those two uses. Skip that. And specifically putting wildflower strips around field boundaries in croplands, because that in crops anyway, many crops are dependent on pollinators, wild bees and honeybees for production. US agriculture relies on pollinator services for billions of dollars of production. And he's got some pretty fancy modeling going that looks at all of the places you could put a pollinator strip in, and then tries that and goes through using a genetic algorithm to try it. And if that's worse, then you go to a scenario that's better and step through. So he doesn't have to try all of the possibilities to find the ones that are going to be good. And oh, there we go. Good. So what he's looking at is what the trade-offs are, because this kind of modeling gives us a way for trade-offs. And this one isn't specifically for grazing land, but this is the kind of thing that I'm working towards, even in grazing land. So if you are willing to sacrifice X acres of cropland to put in pollinator strips, what is the biggest bang for the buck you can get in terms of pollinator abundance and reduction in nitrogen runoff from your crop fields, because most pollinator strips are perennials. So given that kind of information on trade-offs, what are the options? If you put them here on these fields, maybe you get more nitrogen reduction and more pollinator services while losing only a little bit of crop production. But in a grazing system, it might be, well, if we decide to put perennials here and our annual crops there, because many farms have some of both, these are the consequences for soil loss versus if we do it the other way around, these are the consequences of soil loss and for production. And so we're back to the role of science in characterizing those trade-offs and characterizing the risks and characterizing the potential outcomes, both on the farm and off the farm. So this is where I'm trying to go. We're not there yet. We've got a lot of data to start from. We've got a lot of expert knowledge about plant management and pasture management and soil management, and are working on developing the tools that give us the capability to better assess risk and potential outcomes and trade-offs among all of the management options that are available, given the context of the site. And there are lots of other research groups working on this. I just wanted to mention a couple that are both collecting data and working on developing decision support tools. One is Pastureland SEEP, and that's the grazing component of the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, which is an NRCS-led effort to better understand grazing land condition and the need for and use of conservation practices in grazing lands. And the National Resource Inventory is related to that and is a great source for more data, both on pasture composition and on conservation practice usage in privately owned grazing lands in the US. And the other one is USDA's Long-Term Agroecological Research Network, LTAR, which is croplands and grazing lands and sites that have both, like those in the Northeast, across the US. And this is a large and well-funded research project, but you can see that even with that, we still only have 18 sites to cover the entire US. We can't be everywhere doing everything. So we need these models and other tools to, understand how to make good recommendations for science-based decision-making across the US. So again, what I'm trying to do is bring together all of the science data from all different scales, greenhouse, fields, farm, and landscape, to help articulate clearly what the possible choices are, so that the people who need to make those decisions have the best available data that they can then take into their own knowledge and understanding and objectives and go from there. So I think we're going to get everybody back for questions now. Is that? Yeah.
We are going to get everyone back. Yeah, so if you guys could all come up. Thank you so much, Damon. We're going to do questions from the audience. I also have a couple of questions from folks online. So you too, Eric. So would anyone like to start with a question from the audience? And if not, I'll ask something online to kick us off.
I certainly hope so. The more data, the better.
Is there any chance of streamlining, like putting all three of you together of some sorts and comparing the research that way?
Yeah, and so I certainly hope so, because the more data we can have on the more different operations and the more different contexts and management strategies, the better we can make these decision support tools down the road, and the more sure we can be that we're giving reasonable and reliable answers.
Hi, so I just wanted to say I was so interested in all three topics within this section, but my question is for Sarah. What was the article you were referencing? I know you were speaking about a gentleman's research with the pollinator strips. I was interested on what resource that's being pulled from, because I'm very interested in that.
I'm happy to talk more about that later, but that's ongoing work that a postdoc of mine is doing right now, and it's not published yet.
Wonderful.
So,
well, thank you.
Hopefully in the next few months, we'll get a paper out.
Cool. Additional questions?
This question is for Sarah. It struck me when you said there was just 8 to 12 forage species, regardless of the actual pasture makeup. I wonder what the USDA is defining as a forage species, especially in light of some of the work that we've done as farmers around ruminants eating weeds as a good supplement to their, and also kind of, it seemed like the focus was on, diversity of grass species. And I wonder, like kind of in the light of what Christine Jones has done around diversity of different kinds of plants, not just grasses, and how that figures into your study.
Okay, so the first question on what's a forage species. Yeah, no, I completely agree that that's a problematic kind of distinction. What we did for that was to look at which species were commercially available, being marketed as forage species, and the NRCS grazing specialist species lists for the states in our region to try to get a handle on what would be commonly accepted as a forage species rather than the eat the weed stuff. Which is also true and important. And I'm not saying that those other 50 species in a pasture weren't being eaten or weren't contributing valuable components to the grazing forage. And none of the diversity species were focused on grasses specifically. We found a lot of grass species. We found more grass species than legume species because there are more grass species that can grow in pastures in the Northeast. But both the on-farm research and the trials both used a lot of legumes and forb species, not just all grass species. Because I totally agree with everything you said.
Hi, Sarah. Just to follow up, I know it's hard to see when you have like Kathy Soder, USDA, but to follow up on that question and her response, you have to remember this study was done 20 years ago, going on it. So a lot of what you're talking about has come into vogue, Christine Jones and eating weeds and that's a lot of things have changed since that study. But to go back and recreate that study would be a huge undertaking.
Yeah, right. When we did this was foundational. Nobody had gone out and looked at pasture plants in the Northeast before in this way. And now there's a lot more information out there.
Across all three of your presentations, you were talking about how different farming practices impact all these different responses, whether it's profit, environment, soils. Just curious how to everybody, how you think about like optimizing, how specific are you in those practices? Thinking of like management intensive rotational grazing, we could come up with a definition for it, but everybody has their own definition for it. There's different ways to do it that have presumably very different outcomes.
Somebody else want to try that one?
Yeah, I really liked what Sarah said about how scientists can't tell individual farmers what to do, but we can give them the different options that are available to them. I know, for example, we published research on almonds, and in almonds, we kind of give general broad advice. Like, I mean, it's the same stuff you hear in a lot of places: reduce tillage or plant to cover, something like that. But then it's all tailored specifically to that particular industry. And how they can do it more specifically, like in the almond groves, for example, what cover crops they can plant and how they can terminate, or how they can manage them, how they can mow them, not necessarily terminate them. There's so many, in the Texas Panhandle, we went and we saw growers removing their cattle 6 times a day, and they called themselves rotational grazers. And then we saw people who move their cattle once every 2 weeks, and they called themselves rotational grazers. So it's definitely tough to pin down what we mean when we describe certain practices. But then in those given regions, I think just meeting those growers where they are with their contexts, and then being specific based on that region is the best that we can do right now. That's what we're doing. Yeah.
So maybe just as an add-on there. So for our project, because we're providing payments, we have to have like a definition of like, there has to be some sort of like around rotational grazing, like 72 hours is sort of the USDA definition of what would constitute that, what we can pay on. As a social scientist, I kind of would default to the farmer, right? I think I see things, and by virtue of coming from this from a very different perspective, we kind of default to the perspective of the farmer, making a decision based on their context, their particular species diversity in their fields, their animals. So I think there's kind of a trade-off there always, and there's not really a clear and fast answer. I think the reality of our project, it means that we have to provide these stipulated definitions that sort of like provide very nice, neat boundaries around these things. But ecological systems don't exist in that way, right? No system exists in that way. And so I think there's this trade-off between trying to fit something within like, what is a scientific rigorous study that can provide data that we can like look at and have statistical significance around and like be able to point to and say, see, this is valid, this means this, we can rely on that, versus like these really messy, complex systems that just don't really conform to any of those things. So I think it kind of depends a bit on like the needs of the project, but also I think where we're all coming from individually. As a social scientist, I feel like sometimes I have the easiest job because I can kind of be a little more like, I don't know. But yeah, I think there's also other value in social science beyond that. But anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your presentations. I'm going to try to keep this question as succinct as possible, but I have a general question about setting up your projects. And you keep mentioning, of course, farmers are diverse in the sense of having their own different values and motivations for their management decisions. In your projects, how are you reaching a diverse group of farmers? Are you reaching a diverse group of farmers? I mean, I'm thinking about my organization personally, and most of the people that participate in our climate programming are first generation farmers. Are you working with mostly people who are familiar with USDA or a university system? I know, Eric, you're working from different nonprofit approach. Is there benefit to that and bringing in folks that maybe wouldn't even call things quote unquote climate change? What does that look like for you?
Definitely region by region, the diversity of the farmers really changes. Like the Texas Panhandle, that was just a bunch of old white dudes. And then, but Vermont had, I mean, the diversity of farmers in Vermont, like the gender diversity is awesome. I mean, we had more than half of our farmers in Vermont were women farmers. So I don't really know how we necessarily go out selecting the farmers. I think really what we do is we put up those QR codes and we let people sign up. And then when we have a certain size in a given region, we'll go there and then we'll do our year one samples there. And then kind of when we're more established in that region, like when we were in the Texas Panhandle, we were hanging out with this professor at some university out there, and he was telling us about the research they were doing. So we kind of get in an area and then let our farmer population expand from there. But it's something I know that we're focusing more on all kinds of aspects of diversity in farming. More now, especially as we expand to more East Coast projects. And then I'm not exactly sure what your question was with the nonprofit aspect of the research that we were.
Many people that would not want to work, that do not want to work with USDA, but they still have, no offense, but still have incredible interest and are doing these practices that are transitioning, from maybe a more quote unquote conventional system to something with more intensive grazing management. Just how are you reaching people that are coming from different schools of thought?
Yeah, and I have not done much for picking the farmer groups we go to, but it seems to me that initially I guess there's two approaches. We have the self-selecting crowd, everyone signs up, and then we have a cluster in the Texas Panhandle because we got a bunch of people who signed up and want us to go there and measure their farms. Or and this sometimes comes from our grant funders that they want us to examine, particularly like especially female farmers, North Carolina or something. That's something we're trying to figure out how to do. So we have the self-selecting crowd who come to us, and then we have other objectives, and we kind of try to approach those people. But I don't know if people are more or less receptive to us than any other research organizations. I've not done too much of the farmer outreach stuff. But the farmer diversity question and the farmer population, yeah, that's a really good one. And we're trying to be more intentional about that now, because definitely the people who tend to sign up are the landowning dudes in Texas or Montana or something. So
yeah, I think this is like a super important question that it's like inherent in everything that we do, like in all of this work, but it's something I think we don't know really how to tackle quite yet. I mean, for our project, nominally it's open to anyone. Anyone can apply, anyone can join. The reality of it is, we have 15 exceptional farmers that are in many ways like very different from your average Vermont farmer. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that, but I think with all sort of many of these programs, whether it's a payment program or something else, anybody can sign up, but not everyone has the time to do that. Like an application process takes a lot of time. To write a grant takes a lot of time. People don't maybe not have the technical skill to do that. They don't have the time to do that. some farmers don't even like use computers. They just don't. Like there are older farmers that like may be really well suited for some of these projects that just don't have access to it. So I think the equity and access question is like really challenging. In our project, I think we provide like data collection and application payments for farmers to like do the work that it takes to like actually apply for these programs in the first place. I think that can offset some of that. But I think there's like a much bigger conversation around who has access and equity and what sort of resources we provide to that. You know, sometimes I think like maybe a better use of some of our resources would just be like if we just went out and wrote grants for farmers, right? Like maybe that's the best way to spend $2.5 million. Like maybe there's a program out there that should just do that. I know conservation districts do some of that, but they also have their own constraints around labor and capacity. But I think like this is not, for me at least, this doesn't seem like a tangential like problem. This seems like a very central problem to like a lot of these programs. And I think figuring out how to tackle that in ways that are equitable and improving access is like a really important thing going forward. And yeah, I think maybe we have a bunch of ideas around that, but in terms of like systemically, institutionally, how we go about doing that is something we're still very much sort of figuring out. So.
Can I actually comment on that as well? As a former extension person, I think having local champions is huge when trying to source. So if you are a local service provider who's got farmers that you work with, you keeping track of what's going on and getting your farmers connected to them. There's an ownership for service providers. Like we love our farmers and we protect them and we want to get them connected to things. And I think that's actually why ecdysis has been able to hit the Northeast so much, is there have been a half dozen folks in New York and Maine and Vermont who connected farmers to them saying they're coming, you need to be on this if you want to be on it. So the local champion piece is pretty big, I think. I also want to take this moment since I have the mic. We do have a couple of questions from online. Sarah, there was a question. If I understand this correctly, I'm not familiar with the Pareto frontier, but one of the questions that we had was for how many services can you look at a Pareto frontier, and are there more than the ones that are there?
So that's something from mathematical optimization theory, which came out of economics and finance, looking at, what are the best possible scenarios along a range of options. So like, what is the best possible scenario with all the pollinator strips? And what is the best possible scenario with all of the nitrogen reduction? And then what are normally the ones in the middle are more interesting. And what are the trade-offs among all of the things that don't just have one or the other, but have everything? And so you can do that for as many ecosystem services as you want. The INVEST model has about 20 right now. We're starting small, but it's really hard to put that in a figure. So
that's super fair. So another sort of question before you leave the mic, a broad question, I think, of what's the ecosystem model that's not good for crop growth?
So we're using INVEST, which is a really widely used set of ecosystem services models. It's got a bunch of different modules for all kinds of things. And it has a module for crops, but it doesn't actually do crops very well. That hasn't been a focus of the people who developed it. So we're working on a better crop module so we can actually use it for agriculture in a way. It was developed for making conservation-based decisions on ecosystem services. So it treats agriculture as kind of a thing we don't care about as much as we care about other things, which is not where we come from as agricultural people.
I've got more from the online group, but would anyone in the audience, do you all have another question? All right. Nico has a question.
So a lot of these things that you are doing have implicit and explicit connections to certification potentially of farming practice, certifying farming practices to ecological impact or outcomes. Is there anything that either three of you have done or your organizations to think in that direction? I know this is a loaded question with organics and other certifications that we've all gone through in the cycles over the last 10, 15 years, and a lot of them have fallen on their face or gotten taken over or corrupted by other political interests. But nevertheless, this is an interesting question and a worthwhile question because there's economic benefit that comes to farmers through those programs. Thanks.
As far as I know, I don't want to speak. I don't want to determine this for what advice might want to do in the future, but I think we're pretty opposed to aligning ourselves with any particular certification. We have a lot of them reaching out to us, like pretty much all the private ones you can imagine, and we don't work with them. We just want to do this, do our own research, give the data back to the growers. We don't give the data to anyone else, and just kind of leave it at that.
This is definitely something we've heard from like farmers we work with, that like it would be nice to have a metric we could point to, and from a marketing perspective, especially around like carbon, right? Like if I'm managing rotationally, can I say I've, been able to like sequester this much carbon per acre, whatever. From a marketing perspective, that'd be really attractive. I don't think we're going to have the data for that generally. Another question we got is like other metrics that could be used that would be able to, and not anything maybe certification wise, but something that just like data that we could provide that would have that validity. We had this conversation last year about like, could we say like a rotational farmer is conserving like 1,000 like earthworms per meter or something? Like, is there like a metric, a weird metric that could like really like connect with consumers, that consumers would really react to? So something we've been thinking about and talking about. But in terms of the data and what we're going to actually be able to say, it's hard at this point. But I think this I had showed a sheet during my presentation, which is something we're working on with farmers, which is basically going to provide like an overview of their participation in the project. And it'll say like, what are the benefits and costs, sort of give like a sort of 1,000-foot overview of their entire participation throughout the course of this 5-year project. That in our mind is going to be like a tangible thing that we can hand to a farmer, and then they could have that at, if they're at a farmer's market or if they're talking to a consumer, they could have that, they could present that. It would sort of give an overview of the farm, what this sort of work has been about. It would be maybe not necessarily a certification or a marketing thing, but it's something that they can point to that is a tangible output from this project. And that's something that has certainly come from farmers, is like, this is something that we would really value, that would be nice to be able to point to. Like the payments are nice. There are other really great like parts of participating in this project, but it's having something tangible to be able to like hand to a consumer at a farmer's market. So it's something we've thought about, but it's definitely a question of like, what is the data going to actually be able to show in the end? And yeah, in terms of certification, I think that's maybe a broader conversation, but I think an important one. So,
Eric, I have a question for you from our folks online. Is your sampling including soil biology analysis, microbes and fungi or fungi? And if so, what labs are you utilizing?
What labs?
Yeah.
So we do the PLFA test, and that is with, I believe those go to Regen Ag Labs. We send a lot of soil down to Regen Ag Labs in Nebraska, and then the biological analysis is PLFA.
Thank you. So I've also had some questions about the benefits or drawbacks of conversion, either woodland conversion or back and forth. I'm just curious, Sarah, do you know if there's work that's out there that's been done on that, either modeling or larger scale?
I know that there is some work out there. There's not a whole lot. I think that kind of thing is a good candidate for the ecosystem services scenario model I'm talking about, because those are huge changes and they're expensive and the consequences can be really big. So I'm not there yet, but I would like to eventually synthesize the research that is out there into this same context and consequence framework.
So I have one final question, if there are not any other questions. So we've had a request. Oh, you do have one. Excellent.
Just wondering about the role of farmers in generating the research questions you're asking. And if there's sort of any services for farmer generated research, on small or regional scale.
You mean like the Northeast Pasture Consortium research priorities discussion that's going to happen at this conference?
Yes, please attend that tomorrow, 10:30. we'll be here.
I know for dices, we're pretty open-ended with it. Like if we see farmers doing cool things, you know, or if there are a few farmers doing the same thing, then that'll become a have to let the farmers do their thing. We have a few we went to Cleveland to do urban farms. That was like its own little test that we intentionally wanted to do. But generally, yeah, if the farmers doing something cool and we were seeing that they're doing something cool, then we'll just go with it. Oh, I mean, I don't know about that because I don't know if we would add more things to measure since we've already done 800 something farms, and I don't know how that would really affect all of our data analysis. But in terms of farmers like doing cool things, we love seeing what they're doing and then adding that as a consideration into the overall analysis.
Thinking about capturing that anecdotal stuff and turning it into research questions.
We have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get more anecdotal responses from them that we can actually kind of quantify in like words. So that's one thing where we have a few questions where we give them open-ended responses and ask them kind of what they're thinking about, what if there's anything that they wish we would have asked them, or I think we asked them as well if there's anything we would have tested. Definitely if there's anything that they wish we would have asked them. So with our surveys, we try to get a little more open-ended with them and see if there's stuff we might be missing.
So our final question, it's been asked in a couple of different ways and different times. Could you wrap us up by each describing your definition of regenerative agriculture? Gotcha.
As a social scientist, I think my definition of regenerative agriculture is, I mean, you can regenerate soils, you can regenerate ecosystems. If you're not regenerating farms, you're not regenerating farmers, and you're not regenerating agriculture. So I'll leave it at that.
I don't know if I have a definition of regenerative agriculture that's any good, but what I'm focused on is what I started my talk with, the idea of sustainable intensification. We have no more land, but we have more people who need food, and we need to produce that in as, you know, sound and long-term feasible way as possible.
Yeah, I think the regenerative agriculture on a vacant lot in Cleveland looks a lot different than a regenerative agriculture on 50,000 acres in Texas or something, and looks very different from regenerative agriculture in a cornfield in Indiana. And so I think broadly, is that regenerative agriculture occurs when you value life over production, and life could be ecological diversity. It could be soil health, it could be community health, it could be farmer well-being. But I think, yeah, valuing life over production gets close to regenerative for me.
Well, thank you all for sharing your time with us today and your expertise. So before we break for lunch, and everything is ready to go for lunch. So we plan a long lunch. We do an hour and a half break because if you were here earlier and you heard my presentation, or perhaps if you did not hear my presentation, because the audio wasn't working this morning. So much of what the consortium is about is attempting to connect people who don't usually talk to each other. University folks who are in DC or elsewhere, who are really big picture. We want to encourage you all to talk to each other as much as possible. So we don't come back for session until 1:30. And before we go, I'd love a raise of hands. Okay, who in this room is a farmer? Even if you have many hats, who in this room is a farmer? Okay, so if you're a person who doesn't get to talk to farmers, find one. Who here is a researcher in any capacity on any projects? Awesome. Who do we have here who is a service provider? Excellent. So find each other, please, at lunch or at any other time. We've got a good break this afternoon with our poster session. Please find each other, talk to each other, and connect. And for folks who are online, you can absolutely, or folks who are in the room who want to connect with folks that are online, that's also what the Whova interface is really great about. So if you find somebody online that you don't find in person, have a conversation with them too, because it's totally an option. So thank you all so much. Enjoy your lunch.